All right, today we're going to walk through step by step the easy old school way of phase aligning your drums. The reason we phase align a drum kit is to make sure we get the most kick and punch and snap and we get them as hard hitting as possible. So if you want hard hitting drums and you're working with drum stems, this is something that you really need to know. And it's not hard. We're going to get it demystified, go through it step by step, and break it down. Some people do this with plugins like Auto Align, and that's great, but it is important to know how to do this yourself because it does apply to any multi-mic'd source. Now, whenever you're recording something with several microphones, phase alignment just is inherent in the process that there's going to need to be some corrections. You're going to have some issues. So let's dive right in, and I'll show you how to do it. Let's take a listen to the top and bottom snare mics soloed out so you can hear before and after phase alignment. And listen to how much fuller and harder hitting it is when the phase of polarity and timing is aligned. All right, so these are what the drum stems look like when I drag them in. And I recommend doing this process before you do anything else. Before you do any noise gating or setting faders or panning, this is the first thing you do is phase align your drums. In audio engineering, the word phase has two connotations. We can use the word phase when we're talking about timing, like things syncing up correctly, but it's also referring to polarity. And today we're going to cover both as we go. So the whole idea here is to make sure that all of the microphones are synced up in time and that their polarity matches so we get the most of our recording. And as you can see, I don't have any plugins turned on. The noise gates are turned off. All I've done is a little bit of gain staging, and that's where you want to start. Now we have a kick in and a kick out mic here in blue. I'm going to drag those to the top. Dark blue kick in, light blue kick out. Then we have snare top, the dark purple, and snare bottom. Two toms. The orange one is our overheads. And as you can see, that is a stereo track. Even if your tracking engineer did a fantastic job, you might drag in your drum stems and hit play and say to yourself, well, I don't hear any timing issues. I don't hear any weird phasing effects. It all sounds pretty good. So I'm going to ignore this phase stuff. And I highly recommend that you don't do that because like I said, there is going to be some problem somewhere that if you correct them, your drums will hit even harder and sound even better and more full. And if you never do that, you'll never know that you could have gotten even more out of these recordings. What I like to do is sync everything to the overheads for a couple reasons. And we'll get to that. But first, let's start by showing you what we're looking for here. So what you want to do is zoom in all the way on the waveform here to where the very first hit happens. This is the first kick drum of the song. And this is the waveforms when you zoom in. Now, every DAW has the ability to zoom in. You scroll with the mouse all the way down to here. This is all the way zoomed in, and now we're looking at the sample level of time. So tiny, tiny bits of a millisecond here. And I like to scroll out one notch and see the peaks and valleys filled in. I like to see that dark stuff filled in. This is where I like to do my phase alignment. And if we zoom out, we'll see the transient of the first kick and then the decay and sustain of the waveform. And we zoom in all the way to the beginning of the hit. And this is how we phase align our drums. Now, these two are not going to look the same because they're two different microphones. Yes, they're recording the same kick drum, but as you can see, the texture of these blobs is different, and that's fine. What we're looking for is what is on top and bottom of this horizontal line. So it might be hard for you to see, but every DAW shows the waveform the same way. There is a horizontal line here, and these blobs are either above or below the line. Now that's our polarity, and we'll get back to that. And then the timing and the sync, we can tell by looking at these two microphones here, these two waveforms. The timing and the sync is what happens like when you hit play on the timeline from left to right. Right is the future. What I'm looking for here is the peaks and the valleys to see if they line up in time. And we go to the very beginning where the transient is to line that up. After that is a different story, and we'll talk about that later. But as you can see right here where my mouse is, I have a peak and then a valley and then a peak. Same thing on the kick out mic below. I have a peak and a valley and then another peak, and they're pretty well lined up. If I take the top one and drag it one little click, I could do that, and they're slightly more lined up. And that's what we're talking about. Now, if I had zoomed in and they looked like this, then that could be a problem, because you can see the first peak up top is lined up in time with the first valley down below, and that is out of phase. This is where they were in the recording, and so I'm going to move this just one little bit there. Zoom in all the way to the sample level, then you can have the most accuracy there. And that's how we do that. But like I said, I want to align all of this to the overheads, but I wanted to just start with the kicks because they're easy to see so you can get the idea. The timing that we're aligning is the peaks and valleys, and the information above and below the horizontal line is the polarity. And those are the two contexts in which we talk about phase. So now I'm going to drag the overheads in orange up below the two kick drums, and we're going to zoom in on those three. And this is what I do, is I start syncing everything to the overheads. Now, the overheads have also picked up the kick drum, of course, albeit quietly. But it stands to reason here that the close mic'd drums, like the kick and the snare, are going to pick up their instruments slightly faster in time than the overheads, because the overheads are several feet away up above. So that's just a speed of sound thing. The overheads are going to be slightly behind everything else. So another reason I like to sync everything to the overheads is I don't have to worry about trying to back things up before the timeline begins. I can just move everything forward in time to the overheads. It just works a lot easier. Again, the overheads is a stereo track, right? So you have two sets of polarity lines and information going above and below. Now, right here on the overheads, you can see the first peak, and it is in line with the valley of these two kick drums. So I'm going to highlight these two kick drums and drag them together so their first peak aligns with the first peak on the overheads. Now the peaks and valleys are aligned with the overheads. And then I would go down and do this for the entire kit, and then all of my microphones would now be phase aligned in terms of timing or sync. And that's all there is to that. You just want to do this before you do anything else. Now, I'm going to bring these toms up underneath the overheads, and we're going to go further down the song to the first tom hits. And now we're going to phase align our tom mics to the overheads. So let's blow all these up so you can see them. So this first tom mic right here in the dark green, you can see that the first peak is slightly behind the overheads, right? So we need to drag this to the right. And there we go. Now we can see that the peaks right here in a vertical line are perfectly aligned there. The first thing we have is this valley, this trough, then this peak, then the next valley. So there we go. Now this tom mic is aligned with the overheads. And I'll put the other tom mic up here. And the next tom hit is down here a bit. So same thing. We need to move this tom down. And I will zoom in all the way to the sample level. All right. Peaks and valleys are aligned. Now, the stereo overheads, you can see the information. It's just a hair different. Anywhere in this ballpark is fine. The little bit that we just moved it to get the peaks and the valleys more or less in the right spot makes all the difference. You're never going to get this 100%, but we just took it from, say, 95 to 99% or whatever, and that's going to make all the difference in how hard and clean and tight this kit sounds when we hit play. And then the last thing is our snare mics. And this is where we're going to talk polarity. That's snare top in the dark purple, snare bottom in the kind of pinky purple, and then the overheads in orange there. So we're going to go back to the first snare hit of the song. You know, we're fast forwarded to get to the first tom hit of the song, but let's go back to the very beginning and get to our first snare hit and zoom in. And so here we are zoomed in on the snare top mic in the dark purple and the snare bottom below it in the light purple, with the overheads on top in orange. And we can see that the peaks and valleys of the initial transient for both the snare mics need to be dragged to the right a little bit to line up with the overheads. But you'll also notice now, looking at the snare top and snare bottom microphone, that the first peak and valley are not lined up with each other. Now, this is really, really common with snare top and bottom mics, that the snare bottom mic polarity is going to be reversed from the snare top mic because the pressure waves are hitting them in an opposite fashion. And you can run into the same thing with kick mics as well. So we've been working with phase in terms of timing and sync so far, but this is the polarity. This is the first valley, and that's a peak below. And then the first peak up above is a valley down below. So the polarity is different. So what I want to do now is show you what that sounds like. And remember, like I said, you can pull in your drum stems and hit play and never know that you're missing out on some fullness. So here's the two snares by themselves soloed out, and let's take a listen. Now I'm going to flip the phase on the bottom snare mic, and you can see when the green button comes on that the phase has been flipped 180 in the polarity. When the green button is on, the snare sounds a lot fuller. So here, starting without. Yeah, it's way more beefy and weighty, and that's because of the phase cancellation going on because of the phase polarity in the snare drums. And like I said, this is really common with snare mics. You have one on top and one on bottom. It's very common for the bottom one needing to be flipped 180. Now, in Studio One here, I'm hitting the phase polarity button on the channel strip. Every DAW comes with a stock plugin to help you flip the phase as well, but it's probably also somewhere on your channel strip. And now when I go to align the snare bottom microphone with the overheads, I would be aligning the first peak with the first valley because you're not going to see the polarity flip in the waveform here. But another thing you can do is if you want to be able to see it, or if that's confusing, is you can render it down. So for example, I told you every DAW has a plugin that will flip the polarity on a waveform. So what I'm going to do is turn the polarity back to normal on the channel strip, but I'll flip the polarity with this plugin on the snare bottom mic, and then I will bounce it down. So now when we go back in and take a look, the polarity is flipped on the snare bottom mic. So now it has been rendered with the 180 flip, and now I can line the peak of the top mic up with the first peak in the overheads, and same thing with the bottom mic. And now it doesn't look as confusing. So now the first peaks are aligned and the first valleys are aligned. Wonderful. So now we have that hard-hitting snare and everything is cool. But that is the process. Start with the overheads and phase align everything to them in terms of timing, and make sure that you don't have to do any polarity corrections as well. And of course, phase is a complicated topic, like I said, and in terms of polarity, you can get into 45, 90-degree shifts and all that, but typically what you're dealing with is what I just walked you through, which is that you'll have to do a 180 flip on one of the microphones. But that's it. If you take your drum stems and you phase align them to the overheads and fix any polarity issues by flipping the phase, you're going to have all of a sudden a much, much tighter sound. But there's one more bonus here for those of you that stuck around through the entire video. I want to talk to you about the rest of the ADSR. Now, if we zoom back in on these overheads here, the initial transient here is in phase, but the rest of the information in between the snare hits may not exactly be in phase. That's just the nature of the recording. There's nothing wrong with these recordings. The transient is now in phase, which is the most important part, but the rest of the decay and sustain and release of the waveform is going to be unique. So there's going to be little things in there that are out of phase. So now that the whole kit is aligned to the overheads are picking up the entire kit, and the snare and the toms and the kick are going to sound great when they hit, but the stuff in between that the snare and the toms and the kick mics have picked up because they're close mic'd is still going to be slightly out of phase from the overheads. And that is why it's so important to use noise gating. Noise gating and downwards expansion, if you put it on all of your close mics, it'll cancel out so much of that stuff in between that it will really, really minimize any of the weird phase issues going on in between the transient hits. And it's a really, really good thing to know about. It's one of the most important reasons to noise gate and to use downward expanders. So now I will play you the original drum stems the way that they were brought in, and then I will compare that to phase aligned and noise gated so you can hear how much harder they're hitting, but how much cleaner everything is as well. But there you go. Let's take a listen to the original kit now. And everything phase aligned and gated. All right, there you go. Well, thanks for checking that out. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll catch you on the next one.